Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of Making the Argument Special Edition, where we talk about what should the right want. Again, we all seem to be pretty clear on what we're fighting against. We want to defeat woke. But as has been said before, co-belligerence does not necessarily mean allies. And the whole purpose of this series is trying to figure out not just who we're fighting, how we should fight them, but what we're fighting for. What should America look like if we win? I think we will win. I think we have to win. But again, what are we fighting for? One of the things I learned in war was, some of the best fighters are the ones that love what they're fighting for, not hate what they're fighting against. And with us today is a guy that I think is uniquely equipped to talk about this subject. He has a recent book that just came out that brushes up on a lot of this. So I think it's going to be perfect. So once again, Dr. Turley, thank you for joining us again on Making the Argument.
Oh, thanks, Nick. And thank you for making this argument. This is wonderful. I think it's very important for us in thinking beyond just 2026 or 2028. Where are we going in the next generation or two? Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, the first thing I want to do is, I talk about this kind of broad coalition that is against woke, but doesn't necessarily want the same things at the end of the day. So I'm going to put this into three broad categories, and we could dissect this all day long, but just for the sake of time, three broad categories. One category I kind of put into, these are the guys that they're not necessarily philosophically conservative. Mm-hmm. They just cannot stand woke. And people that I would put into this category, people like Elon Musk. Yeah. I don't think Elon Musk is a dyed-in-the-wool conservative or anything like that, but he has a deep, abiding appreciation for freedom of speech. I believe he genuinely loves the country. But I also think that he just kind of wants to reset things maybe a decade or two back, and we'd probably be okay. Then you have the second category. This is more of your classical American conservatives. And I say American conservatives intentionally because when we look at concepts of classical liberalism, free markets, individual liberty, property rights, America kind of has its own spin on this that's different from Europe. Yeah. And so you have a lot of people in this category where it's like, look, we love the Constitution at the fundamental level. We love how our country is organized, but some changes need to take place. These are also people that really think that faith needs to play a much bigger role in our country than it has for the past several decades. That's kind of that category 2 group. And then category 3 is really starting to question everything. Mm-hmm. Some of the common arguments that you'll hear from them is they'll say, look, the Constitution hasn't been able to protect us from wokeness and everything that's going on. We've got to come up with some different guards for our security. Mm-hmm. Some of them might even reference Alexander Hamilton. They say, Alexander Hamilton didn't want a president every 4 years. He wanted a lifelong term for presidency. So it's not completely outside of the American tradition, but we need something a little bit stronger than what we have now. Now, if we can accept that these are kind of three broad categories with a lot of wiggle room within each one of them, which category do you think you would put yourself in and why?
Oh my. Throwing it right at me here, Nick. That's a great question because I think you're bringing together the macro and the micro in a wonderful way. So you're dealing with the large, the massive issues of the manifold movement working itself out in terms of its ideological particularities and diversities. I have to be, and a lot of people are surprised to find this out, that I'm actually rather politically agnostic. I'm fundamentally civilizationalist in my orientation, and I find that's the best way to actually make sense, broad brush, big picture of all of these micro movements, as it were. Well, can I stop looking at what that means?
Can I stop you right there real quick? Because that's very interesting to me. What do you mean when you say you're a civilizationist?
Yeah. So one way of being able to find it is in relation to its opposite of what it's not, and then get into what it is. So it would be the opposite of the dominant ideology of our age, which is progressive realism. And progressive realism is the default ideological stance among our cultural elite, whether it's in politics or media or academia or entertainment, even sports with the NFL. And progressive realists basically assume that the arc of history inevitably bends towards the progressive vision of social justice. It's basically a bastardization of Frank Fukuyama's end of history thesis, that he put forward after the fall of the Soviet Union in the early 90s, where he basically said that all of human history was inevitably moving towards liberal democracy. And the progressive realist basically says all of human history is inevitably moving toward this progressive vision of social justice. And this is why the legacy media always treats the Democrat as innocent until proven guilty, because they're on the right side of history as far as the media is concerned. Whereas the Republicans, by definition, are on the wrong side of history. So they're always guilty until proven innocent, which is virtually impossible given that progressives write the rules of who can be proven innocent and on what basis and so on. But it's basically, the notion is that if you're a conservative, you stand opposed to progress. And so the progressive realist believes that history moves and breathes and has its being according to liberal emancipatory ideals. I am the opposite of that. I'm a civilizationalist, meaning that I see history moving according to the great world civilizations, which is precisely how we learned history, if you think it through, starting with the Egyptian civilization, Mesopotamian, China, Greece, Rome. And so I see history as inevitably defined and shaped by grand civilizational forces, which is, as Sam Huntington would argue, is just simply culture writ large when all's said and done. And so I see politics as inevitably civilizational. We've all heard the maxim that politics are downstream from culture and civilization is culture writ large. So as a civilizationalist, I see politics as inevitably reflective of the culture in which those politics are embedded. So that means you have a Confucian politics, Tenxiat, what they call the mandate of heaven. You've got a Shinto politics. You've got an Islamic politics. You've got, even in our Christian variants, you've got an Orthodox politics like we see in Moscow, or a Catholic politics, or Protestant politics like we saw flourishing here in the United States. And so however our politics work themselves out, it's inevitably going to be reflective of the culture that wins the culture wars. Now, the good news for me is that demographics is basically destiny, and they've already decided largely the outworking of who wins the culture wars. Secular liberals have largely stopped having kids, while conservative Christians are having more kids than ever, right? 20 years ago, Philip Longman noted that the states won by George W. Bush back in 2004 already had a fertility rate that was 12% higher than in states that voted for John Kerry. And since then, that fertility advantage in particular areas among those red states has more than doubled. And so this is one of the reasons why red states are growing and blue states are shrinking. So I think our politics is inevitably an extension of what we're seeing already with the MAGA movement, where I loved how you put it. I would see it as sort of two primary dynamics, the tech right on one side, the trad right on the other. I think they're going to continue to intersect and give us a country that's both very industrious and entrepreneurially dynamic, but also very socially conservative. And I think that tech trad alliance is going to continue for some time. Now, how that relates, say, to like the revival of the classical liberal tradition, which is very important for our nation, we're going to have to see in terms of, just how specific that is. I have to say, Nick, I don't put a lot of stock in ideology, just because I think the age of ideology has ended. So that's where I tend to go with Sam Huntington and the Clash of Civilizations thesis. So he pushed back against Frank Fukuyama by arguing that the age of ideology was the 20th century, where you had three grand global ideologies, basically titans fighting for dominance. So you had, Western liberalism versus Soviet communism versus Nazi fascism. And Fukuyama tried to argue that basically Western liberalism won, whereas Huntington argued, no, what's actually happened is that ideology itself has imploded as the dominant glue of society. It dominated the 20th century for sure, going back to the 18th century and the Enlightenment, looking for a one-size-fits-all political and economic system. What he saw is the balkanization. Huntington saw the balkanization
Yeah.
of the world, and that more and more populations were going back to identity. And so that's
So
why identity politics dominate everything, whether the left or the right, whether we're going to be MAGA or whether we're going to be BLM. It's
yeah.
identity dominates everything. So I see our politics as inevitably going back to this new civilizationalism that's rising all over the world. And I do think that's very good if you're a classical liberal, because that's going to force people to rethink, what does it mean to be an American? That's certainly the education I got as a kid. I actually had I had a really interesting social media meetup with my fourth grade teacher, Miss Coates.
Oh.
She's watching. God bless you. I love you. I've never forgotten of you. She reached out to me. She watches the show. And so she reached out to me and said, it's Miss Coates. And of course, she's married now and kids and grandkids and all that sort of stuff. But she said to me, your grade was the last grade that got real American education, where
Yeah.
we really learned what it was, the glories of what it meant to be an American. So Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and Nathan Hale, I regret I have but one life to give for my country, and all that sort of stuff. To be an American, you knew you belonged to this great civilization of freedom and liberty, and that became a beacon for that in the world. This is before all the woke nonsense and the crazy.
Yeah.
We're racist, we're bigoted, we're phobic, and all this insanity. So what I think we're going to see is we're going to go increasingly back to that. But again, as it's very much rooted in identity, not so much in any kind of abstract ideology.
So, okay. So if we, and let me know if you think this is a fair clarification. Because yes, Samuel Huntington was writing about the clash of civilizations at the same time that Fukuyama was talking about the end of history. And like you said, it was this idea that, okay, kind of like classical liberalism, and maybe we could add on to that Karl Popper's idea of the open society. This is now it. It's all been settled. This is the ideology that we're going to export to the rest of the world, and it's only a matter of time before everyone adopts it. And again, Huntington was like, well, no, there's a lot more that goes into civilizations than just kind of an ideology with respect to maybe the way you order your politics or your economics. There's a lot more. There's a lot deeper substance to it that goes back.
Yeah, religion. He actually believed it all went back to religion. Yeah.
Exactly. Well, and that's interesting too, because you pointed this out. You can't even paint with as broad a brush as Christianity, because Catholic traditions have tended to create different types of social systems than Protestantism has, or Orthodoxy has. Mm-hmm. And so when you say I'm a civilizationist, that can be read a couple of different ways. Like one way it could be say like, okay, I believe that kind of every civilization figures out what they're going to do for them, and that's fine for them. And then I want American civilization to reflect certain values. Other people could come to the conclusion that, well, no, one civilization is going to, dominate, maybe like conquest and things of that nature, right? Whether it was the Persians at one time, or the Romans, or the Greek, or the Chinese. When you say civilizationist, how does that apply to kind of like our current situation? Not just within our politics, but just where you see things going in the future. Ladies and gentlemen, what you need in your life is more steak. This is not up for debate. It's just a fact, and Good Ranchers is here to provide it. I want to warn you on something. You can walk into grocery stores right now and you can get product of the USA meats, all right? But were they really raised here in the United States? We don't know, because Congress kind of screwed it up. But when you get your meat from Good Ranchers, that is beef, pork, poultry, wild-caught seafood, you get it from Good Ranchers, you know it was raised here in the United States and delivered directly to your door. I know this because I eat Good Ranchers almost every day. I absolutely love their product, and I love the company. It is filled of good, God-loving, patriotic human beings. Not to mention the fact that with the holidays coming up, this actually is not only a good gift for you, but a good gift for loved ones. There has never been a better time to get people around the table eating as family, extended family, friends, all of it. And this is a great way to feed them and perhaps check some gifts off the list for for those loved ones that you truly, truly care about. So I want you to go over and use my exclusive code Nick. If you order by December 1st, you'll get an extra $100 off your first 3 orders plus free meat. Go to goodranchers.com, use my code Nick. You're going to get $100 off your first 3 orders plus free meat with that subscription, right? I highly recommend bacon because you can use the bacon to wrap everything else the Good Ranchers is going to send you. Again, this is not just a product I have heard of or that advertises with us. It is one that we use on the regular because they are fantastic. Goodranchers.com, use my code Nick.
Yeah, no, it's brilliant. No, again, you're tracking with it brilliantly. These are exactly the questions that civilizational studies start getting into. Absolutely. Yeah. So the way it's working itself out now, for right or for wrong, this is just, we're on our way here. This is the trek we're going, is through what most scholars are calling a multipolar world. So again, in contrast, up to the fall of the Soviet Union, we were in a bipolar world. It's a world that was dominated by 2 superpowers. So, Western liberalism led by the United States, and then Soviet communism led by the Soviet Union. When it imploded, we ended up with what scholars called a unipolar world, where there was really only one superpower. I mean, Russia was basically just laughed at as just, one big, it's a third world country with a gas station economy and some nukes.
Yeah.
So it was, and during the Yeltsin years, it was pretty broken, no question about it. So we were it. And when you got the Frank Fukuyama conception, married with Charles Krauthammer's Our Unipolar Moment thesis, where he basically said, particularly after 9/11, hey, if we're all going to become liberal democracies, what are we waiting for? If it's inevitable, then let's grab, let's go. And this is exactly, by the way, what Soros argued, and I believe in 1991 or 92 paper called The New World Order. You can read it online. I mean, Soros basically just after he made his billions breaking the Bank of England, he just basically sat around, read far left books and did scholarship all day long. And so he made the argument that NATO needed to be used to inflict, as it were, to impose this open society, liberal world onto nations like Russia and Eastern Europe and the Middle East
So to that point, when you say, here's what I'm hearing. You're saying, look, I'm a civilizationist. I believe that civilizations, that countries, that when you look at politics, it's merely one aspect of an entire culture.
Yeah.
And to try to suggest that you're going to impose through force of arms, a different type of culture, especially one that is typically rooted, like when you talk about the United States, the UK, typically rooted in certain notions of classical liberalism. The idea that you're just going to impose that through force of arms is a little bit ridiculous and contradictory.
Right.
It's not to say you can't impose things through force of arms. That's also been a regular thing in history, right?
Sure. But that's key because oftentimes classical liberals will make the mistake of thinking that they have discovered the one size fits all political economic system for all people, times, and places. And then the irony of that, and again, maybe they have, but the irony of that is that's going back to 18th century European Enlightenment culture. So you're never going to escape culture. Never. We are embodied beings. We're doing it right now with language. We're doing it through Zoom or whatever technology that we're using here. We are embodied beings. Yes, there are things that transcend. There are things that make us human that we all share together: logic, ethics, aesthetics, and so on. But they're always inevitably shaped and embodied and embedded in culture, and culture writ large is civilization. So what you basically had was an attempt in the 1990s and the early aughts to impose this. We didn't think of it. We just thought, hey, the world's going towards liberal democracy, right? Well, the rest of the world says, no, you're trying to impose this 18th century, 19th century industrialized liberalism onto the rest of us, and we don't operate by that way. So fast forward post 2010, and you begin to see Russia and China emerge as what scholars call civilization states, where they reignite their their economies, their military, and their politics to reassert their influence in their own, what we would call, civilizational sphere. And a civilizational sphere is where you dominate a world, but not the world, because they know the only way they hold it together is through a common culture. And so it only goes so far as their culture goes. Now, you can have Belt and Road initiatives and so forth, like China's doing, to try to influence culture here or there. But when all is said and done, they know they are limited to a Sino culture in the same way Russia's limited to an Ortho culture. They don't go beyond that. And that's what we call multipolar world that's rising. India's doing the same with Modi and the BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. It's a Hindu nationalist party, but they're exercising inordinate influence in Pakistan and Bangladesh and Kashmir and so on. So they exercise control over a world within a larger world, and that larger world is increasingly being defined by the return of civilizations. And that was more or less Sam Huntington's thesis.
So let's say that we accept that, and we're not saying I'm assuming we're not engaging in this conversation of like civilization or cultural relativism. It's just is what it is. Like there's certain areas
that descriptive rather than prescriptive. Exactly. Yeah.
Roger. So we have, okay. So as we look at American civilization, one of the internal fights that we're having right now between right and left, and I think it's a little bit more detailed than that. But again, to use simple terms that everyone kind of understands, between right and left, what do you see as the primary kind of internal threat? Like if we don't have some sort of major external threat to the United States, and I don't think we do. That's not to say that I don't think we have threats. I just don't think they're existential.
Right.
But when we look at the United States itself, and this kind of goes back to an old Lincoln quote that, we will either endure forever or die by suicide. Mm-hmm. Do you see kind of that progressive liberalism that you described, or wokeism or whatnot, critical theory?
Yeah.
Do you see that as an internal existential threat to American civilization? Or do you just see it as a part of American civilization that we're working out?
That's a great question. I bet, you know what? I bet if we thought it through, the latter option is a legit option. In that there may have been like seeds of wokeness, as it were, embedded in our civilizational history or so forth. I'd have to think that one through, because my initial reaction is the former. It is, wokeness by its definition is hostile towards wokeness by definition is post-American. Yeah. Wokeness despises America. Wokeness sees the difference between the modern left and, say, like the 1960s left. The 1960s left still trusted America's institutions by and large. So Martin Luther King's major criticism was that an entire demographic of people were not being treated equally under the eyes of the law. Whereas in modern, CRT and critical theory, it's the law itself that is racist. So that's what you got to get, So for the 1960s left, and again, I know there were some radicals that were already there, but for the vast majority of them, there was a sense that the people in charge were failing the ideals of the nation.
Yeah.
The modern left sees those ideals themselves as inherently wicked.
Yeah.
That's what you got to get. They hate it. That's why they're more loyal to illegal migrants than they are citizens. Citizens perpetuate a racist society, whereas the illegal migrant is somehow innocent of that, you see.
So it's an interesting idea that you could have a internal theory or an internal critique of civilization that is so hostile to the United States that it wants to completely, if not erase it, turn it into something that bears absolutely zero recognition to what it was at its founding.
Right.
So you have that, and then it's this question of, okay, but was there something in our philosophy at the beginning?
Yes.
That made it not only possible, because a lot of things are possible with right circumstance, made it possible or made it inevitable.
Yes.
And one of the questions I have on this, because this has come up as we've talked about this a lot, is does what make a theory like wokeism more or less inevitable within the American or the classical liberal tradition? Is what makes it inevitable kind of the separation of classical liberalism from any sort of like transcendent faith tradition? So to say that if I put classical liberalism on top of a transcendent faith tradition, it puts in parameters and boundaries which allow you to get the benefits without the excesses. But if I remove the faith tradition, which in the United States is Christianity, if I remove that, well, now all of a sudden, equality becomes equality becomes an infinitely malleable term.
Yes.
And now it becomes the highest ethic. The highest ethic is equality or self-actualization or all these other ideas
and so on.
Yes,
I think you're on to it, and there have been studies on this actually. Because, so let's give classical liberalism its due, and a very important due. What class in 18th and 19th? This is by the way, one of the big problems when you start reading John Stuart Mill and all these guys is not everyone actually has a coherent definition of what it means to be liberal, right?
Rousseau is very different from Locke. Is very different from
exactly. But most scholars boil it down to two tenets. When all is said and done, it's probably reductionist, but it's helpful, at least for the discussion. And that is the default to reason and rationality in all matters involving the public square, and the restraint of executive power so as to maximize individual freedom. So a classically liberal society should be rational and free. That's the idea. And there was a very interesting study by Mary Poovey on the history of the fact. So she basically asked the question, when did we start saying terms like statistics say, or, or just facts-based reasoning? Well, she traces it back to the French Enlightenment and particularly the French Revolution. And when you got rid of your clergy and your monarchy, you got rid of this notion that there were some people, by virtue of their special divine charism, had a special divine knowledge. So that's how they could claim they had a special right to rule. And so without that, now with a supposedly, value-free, neutral public square, you needed a form of reasoning that justified public policy for the masses that put these people in public power to begin with. So that's where you start getting the idea of common sense and facts and statistics and indicators and so on. The problem, and this is, Jordan Peterson's actually done a lot of work in this area. The problems we got into the 1960s in both the area of reason and in the area of restraining executive power. That's where those both began to get strained. So we saw it the first in our universities, where more and more faculty members were actually questioning the whole neutrality of reason. So this is where you get post-modernity emerge. So reason is rooted in the 18th century modern era. So we moved away from sort of religion as a primary means of knowing and going more into reason and scientific rationalism and so forth. But in the 1960s, you actually had a faculty, more and more faculty throughout the universities adopting critical theory and so forth, seeing reason itself as being used as a weapon of colonialism and
a tool of the patriarchy of oppressive power structures.
Exactly. And now, of course, that's natural today, but back then it was pretty radical stuff. But and you got to let this hit you. These were the guardians of liberalism. These are the universities. So the guardians of classical liberalism started questioning the fundamental tenet of liberalism, which was the neutrality of reason as a primary means of being able to govern the public square. And then at the second time, we saw it in the 60s, particularly with the rise of the Great Society. You saw the state begin to push out any, alternative mediating institutions in the public square, like the church and community and family and guilds and different organizations. And it
I
started
feel
to
like Marx.
exercise. Yeah, it started to exercise a sort of monopoly over the public square, pushing all of these intermediary institutions into the periphery. And so the restraint on executive power began to fall apart when people started being seen as sovereign individuals rather than belonging to a faith, belonging to a community, belonging to a tradition. Now you were a sovereign individual that had no more obligations apart from that which you chose for yourself. Basically, we became Meghan Markle in a nutshell. And so,
Well,
so you have reason collapsing in the universities, and then you have the restraint on executive power collapsing in the public square. And so, yes, liberalism, far from being rational and free, ended up becoming irrational and repressive. And that is called wokeness.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. I was thinking about this the other day, how I grew up in an environment when I was younger, and I was born in 79. Reason was still logic, the scientific method. These things were all considered neutral for the most part, right? Now, in some elements of the university, that obviously wasn't the case, but it hadn't gone into the mainstream. If someone had come to me and said, men can become women and women can become men, and it's all just a social construct, we would have looked at them like they were a space alien, right? It would have been absurd. Same thing with this idea. If somebody had looked at me and said, logic is a tool of the patriarchy in order to, marginalize, distress, or oppressed populations, it'd be like, that's
using a
that's
logic
idiotic
argument to make that argument, of course.
Yes,
right?
Yeah. And but what's fascinating to me is that I also grew up in an environment where, like you said, whenever you were making any sort of argument with respect to the public space, especially if it had anything to do with civics, logic and evidence-based analysis, that was what you got to use.
That's exactly
because
right.
those were neutral. And now I'm not imposing my religion upon you or anything else that might be claimed. And it was fascinating to me that I've gotten to a point now where someone will argue with something and I'll be like, wait a second, you're telling me that if I want to reference Leviticus as a reason to believe something, or I want to reference the Bible as a reason to believe something, that is off limits.
Right. That's right.
But your notion of self-actualization has to be paramount within the. So literally, it's you don't accept any method of communication or reason or discourse that doesn't involve you winning. Like that's what it goes.
Exactly.
It's heads I win, tails you lose.
That's right.
Yeah. And I this kind of took me down another path where I started thinking about, well, wait a second, because the other thing I had always grown up hearing was you can't legislate morality.
Right.
Okay, well, I've been a legislator for 10 years, and I can tell you that in 10 years of legislating, everything we've legislated has been morality, no matter what side of the aisle.
Exactly.
Every single law is based upon a moral premise.
Absolutely.
And now this is and not being allowed to ask the question, from whence does the moral, what is the moral law that we are appealing to suggest, So here's my question. If we can recognize that wokeness has gotten to a point where they've taken they've taken advantage, maybe that's a better way to put it. They've taken advantage of certain elements of the liberal tradition with respect to a basic understanding of equality before the law or individual liberty. And they've now turned that into almost this desire to be liberated from reality, right? Whatever I want, whatever I think, however I identify, if you don't reaffirm that, you're now oppressing me. And I want to get your take on this, because for a long time, I always looked at like the kind of the hyperbolic claims where I would disagree with a colleague about tax policy and I was a racist, right? Or I was a sexist. And I'm sitting here trying to make sense of this.
Right. Because you're using logic, of course.
Right. And the only way I could make sense of it is, okay, they are using hyperbolic language in order to try to categorize me in a certain way in order to deprive me of moral legitimacy in the public square.
Yeah.
So this is not about having a debate. This is about shutting down debate by making me a pariah.
Yes.
Okay, I get that reason. But then something changed. The moment it started to be fascist, Nazi, threat to democracy, you're guilty of transgenocide. I'm like, oh, this is different. They're not trying to rob me of moral legitimacy. They're trying to create a moral framework whereby they can use violence against me.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
So, I mean, do you think that's what's happened, and how do you think we got from there to here?
Yeah, because no, you said. I mean, you set it up brilliantly. I mean, so it goes back to this notion of radical perspectivalism. It's the opposite of a communication theory of governance. So communication theory of governance is what you and I grew up with. This is part of our American experiment. It's part of the Western tradition in general. And that's this notion of, look, we're not going to agree on everything. We'll probably, if anything, we might have very different political and social views and so forth. But in the end, we're all part of the same culture. We're all part of the same history. We go to the same ballpark. We watch the same movies. We speak the same language. So there's far more that unites us than divides us. So, okay, we may have some disagreements, and they may be very serious ones, but we can work them out. That's the communication theory of governance. And it's precisely what a constitutional republic is based on, a democratic discourse is based on, and so forth. But then there's a different way of looking at the world, and that's radical perspectivalism. And radical perspectivalism is an extremist conception of the world that basically says that a very a peripheral conception of reality is morally and epistemologically exhaustive. And what it does is it sanctifies its boundaries in such a way that if you in any way, shape, or form demur or dissent, you're not just wrong, you've committed heresy.
Got it.
It is heretical. And what do you do with heretics?
You burn them.
Well, if you're nice, you excommunicate them. But you know what else you do to heretics.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so what I think we've been seeing of late is simply the natural, organic, dare I say, progressive outworking of cancel culture. If cancel culture is seen as a form of excommunication, then inevitably, this is just part of it. These are human categories. Again, we're all cultural, but those categories extend to every single human person. So it's not relative. It may be relative how it works itself out, but it's absolute. Every culture has a form, some kind of excommunication. Now, generally speaking, you're a healthy society when you have very lax rules for ultimate excommunication. I mean, you have to do something really bad to get excommunicated. I mean, from society. But when you're a radical perspectivalist, you could say there's only two genders and that's it. You're inherently you're not wrong, you're evil. And so you have to be expelled. And expulsion from society is not enough if it's just simply economic, or if, God forbid, we end up building a parallel society. We end up building a parallel economy like we've done so powerfully that I think now is more or less the patriot economy. It's become mainstream. Thank you, Elon, for that. Yeah. So I think the violent element to it is the natural outworking. And just the same way calling you a racist or a bigot was the prerequisite to getting you excommunicated, silencing you. So now calling you a Nazi and a fascist is the prerequisite to, in effect, eliminating you, right? You know the saying, right? We're not people, our side are not being attacked because we're fascists. We're being called fascists so that we will be attacked.
So this begs a very important question, and this kind of goes into the next phase of the conversation is, okay, how do we fight that while maintaining our own integrity within our morals, within our values? In Romans chapter 12, it says, do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good.
Yes.
Now, I am seeing more and more people on the right, And look, there's a part of you that you understand the reasoning, right? I struggle with the application, but I understand the reasoning. There's people on the right that are saying, look, if the normal systems that we had in play for dealing with wokeism worked, they would have worked.
Mm-hmm.
They're not working, and so now we need something more extreme. So whereas someone that is very, very dedicated to more of like the classical American tradition would say, yes, you can defund. We should have never been funding through tax dollars Planned Parenthood and these NGOs where money was just getting filtered through a bunch of like liberal think tanks and things like that.
Right.
Yeah. They would absolutely be fine with the legitimate use of power when it comes to, shutting down the borders or deporting people that are here illegally. Like they're all fine with that. But then there's those that go that extra step and they're like, that's not enough. They committed lawfare against us. We must now commit lawfare against them. And they don't mean prosecute someone for actually violating crimes.
No, they want martial law, man.
they want to take that additional step. And their attitude is, well, Nick, if somebody keeps punching you in the face and your attitude is, well, can you imagine what it would be like if we punched them in the face?
Yeah.
And that's your only response. You're never getting. So what do you think of this argument that the way we fight wokeism is we need a little fire with fire when it comes to pushing back against this ideology?
Well, there's probably some truth to that. I mean, in the sense that if you're dealing with a war, I mean, if this is about trying, to me, though, I have to say, I think there's a fundamental difference between those of us on the right and those on the left. If we are, pushing the boundaries of what's allowed in our constitutional republic, it's ultimately to save it. Whereas they just want to burn the effing thing down.
Yeah.
That's the fundamental difference. And we can't lose sight of that. We're not them. We are not the same. But that said, I think there is something, I think there's a blessing in the midst of all this that can help make sense of how to approach this. And that's and again, by God's grace, that's the fact that wokeness basically entails its own demise. It has its own futility built into it. Like any idolatry, it will inevitably implode in on itself. By the way, that's how most movements do eventually die. It's a combination of external pressure that we bring to bear on it, but then the internal contradictions end up cracking and it ends up falling apart from within. So it's not just external pressure. It's also the internal contradictions that will cause wokeness to fall apart. And when all is said and done, wokeness by its nature is inherently divisive. Wokeness, when you look at all of the studies that have been done on what, on this radical perspectivalism that's taken over a portion of the left, what they found is you take any woke issue out there. It doesn't matter if, it's open borders, if it's, standing up for illegal migrants, if it's men and women's sports, CRT in the classroom, whatever it is, you take any woke issue, something absolutely fascinating happens. You poll it and you will find that it actually splits the left in half. So you're going to get half the left all for it. But then you're going to get the other left, the Bill Maher left. At one time, the Piers Morgan left. He's left the left. He's now fully on the right at this point, very pro-Trump. But they're going to be against it. They're not going to want to have anything to do with it. And yes, they're going to. And in many respects, Elon Musk argued he was once one of them. He voted for Biden in 2020, admittedly so. So you take any woke issue, it by definition splits the left, while at the same time it actually unites the right. So you ask the right, do you buy into whatever woke issue? And you're going to get 100% hell no.
So this is a really interesting point, because again, I remember sitting on the floor of the Virginia House of Delegates one day, and I'm listening to floor speeches from the other side of the aisle. And I'm listening to two very woke members of the General Assembly talk about issues. And one gets up and gives a floor speech. Everyone stands and claps. And then somebody else gets up and gives a floor speech, and everyone stands and claps. And I'm looking at one of my colleagues on my side of the aisle going, do Wait, do they realize that floor speech contradicted that floor speech? Right? Because one was talking about women's rights and feminism, and the other was talking about trans rights. And my colleague looked at me, he goes, Nick, I've always wondered when they were going to see the contradiction until I realized they all serve the same master.
Yeah. No, granted.
And I was like, oh, that's
Granted.
that's a powerful condemnation. But what was interesting about it is, where was the lie? Right?
Yeah, right.
But what was interesting was, so one of the ways that so what you could say is, we're talking about the rights coalition and the differences we have with respect to how we identify the problem, the source of the problem, and what we want once we, presumably win. But you make a very, very important point that it's not like the left is some monolithic group that agrees on everything across the board. They've got their own internal fights. Do you think one of the only things keeping them together is a common enemy? And do you think that we're starting to see the breaks in the left by that common enemy?
Oh yeah, no, it's falling apart. I mean, we saw it in 2016 with the white working class defecting en masse away from the Democrats. So that's why you had nearly 200 counties in Wisconsin and Iowa and Michigan and Pennsylvania and Minnesota and Ohio that had voted Democrat in every single presidential election for 30 years suddenly shift en masse and vote for Trump. Remember, Iowa voted for Obama twice. Let this hit you if you want to realize what a watershed moment 2016 was. Okay, Iowa voted for Obama twice. Ohio voted for Obama twice. Florida voted for Obama twice. Yeah. Let that hit you. These were either purple or blue states. They are now solid red. They have a voter registration advantage for Republican by double digits. That's largely because in Ohio and in Iowa, and increasingly in Pennsylvania, in my backyard, that's largely because of this mass defection of the white working class. Then in 2024, it started earlier. It started really in 2018-ish, 2022 with the re-election of DeSantis. Then we started seeing the non-white working class defecting, particularly Latinos. And now, increasingly, thank you, Charlie, we've been seeing Gen Z begin to move away as well. So this is the inherent effect of wokeness. Wokeness may not have divided the Democrat leadership, but it has literally gutted their rank and file so that they don't have Nick, they don't have a coalition anymore.
I do think dead. One of the most interesting pieces of polling I'd seen in a while was they were polling. I think it was either 18-year-olds or 20 and under. I can't remember, but it was young. It wasn't the typical youth vote, which goes all the way up to like 29, right? It was
30,
18-year-olds, and Trump had won an overwhelming majority of white males under 18. He had won a solid majority of white women under 18. And he had actually won a majority of minority males under 18. The only category that he lost, significantly to was minority females.
I thought you were going to say cat ladies.
But it goes to your point, because I do think some of the people that really want to see more of a hardcore response that you could say is maybe outside of the American tradition, maybe they're giving the woke a little bit too much credit on their overall strength. Is that the point that you're making? Or?
Exactly. What we want to make sure as we approach this, however we do, again, I tend to be a bit politically agnostic here. I'm with whoever's on the side of civilization, right? Particularly reawakened American civilization, no question. But what we have to understand is we're going with the grain, not against it. They're the ones going radically against the grain. They're the ones who split the left and unite the right. And if you split the left and unite the right, then by definition, more people are going to come out to vote against you than will vote for you. You and I have talked about the 80-20 doom loop before, Nick. And this is it. This is it in like real time. If you divide up just nice and simple, if you divide up the electorate between left and right, 50% left, 50% right, and if they are splitting the left, then the most they can possibly hope to get to support their issues is 25%. There's the 80-20 doom loop right there.
And it has been fascinating to watch. When I talk to people and they ask the question, like, how do we fight back against wokeness? I always say, look, I think the Trump administration has done an excellent job on picking those 80-20 issues, which has further caused the division in the left while rallying everyone on the right to be like, yes, see, it can. Oh my gosh, you mean we can close, you mean we can actually fix the border without the big bipartisan border bill that Joe Biden said was absolutely essential. Well, I want to shift to this third question.
Yeah.
And that is, okay. If we agree that there is so much to love and admire about the American founding, about the philosophy and the faith that informed the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, concepts of federalism, individual liberty, private property rights, market economies, et cetera, like all that, we're like, yes, okay, we like this, we want to preserve it. We do have to come to grips with the fact that something brought us to this point where almost every single culturally shaping institution in America turned against those principles, whether we're looking at education, academia, media, you name it, the bureaucracy, all of it seemed to have been turned against the very things that I think you and I would say we're fighting for.
Yes.
And so the question is like, okay, let's say we win this thing. Right. Let's say we win this thing and woke is broken and now we're moving on. We're moving on.
Woke is broke.
Woke is broke and we're moving on. What, if any, significant or structural changes do you think we need to make either culturally or politically in order to advance the kind of American civilization that you want to see and to protect it from both external and internal threats? Ladies and gentlemen, I don't like the Federal Reserve. And I really don't like fiat currency because, quite frankly, I am tired of living in an inflation to inflation style of economy. And that is why I am getting a lot more interested in precious metals. It's also why I reached out to Lear Capital, because I appreciate the fact that they're not just trying to sell me something without actually educating me about it. In fact, Lear Capital will send you a free investor kit that includes a $4,500 gold report where you can actually learn about how you can actually own physical gold. That's right. When your government decides to debank you, the question is what do you have on hand that actually has genuine intrinsic value that has stood the test of time? Lear will set you up to actually own gold, silver, precious metals on your physical location, right there, your safety deposit box, your safe, you got it. Plus, they will also educate you on how you can actually roll it over into your 401k, into your IRA, all of that good stuff. Plus, my viewers get a special offer of up to $15,000 in bonus gold or silver with qualified purchase. Now, if you want to learn more about this, I'm going to encourage you to get started today by calling Lear at 800-707-4575. That's 800-707-4575, or visit nick4lear.com. That's Nick, the number 4lear.com. We thank him for advertising for us. Go over there, get educated, be able to protect your investments.
Yeah. It's I mean, Nick, man, you're right. These are the ultimate questions, dude, that you're asking. This is so good. Yeah. So let's start big picture and then zero in. So I think big picture, the good news is that finally, for the first time in probably 300 years, the world is moving in the direction of conservatives. There's a reason why conservatives are so pessimistic. It's because for 300 years, the world was going Libby. That's just the way it was working. From the 18th century Enlightenment onward, pretty much every single traditional, culture, custom, religion was being challenged by this new progressive, bold new world that we were supposed to enter into. And that was the age of ideology, and it ravaged us. And by the way, we were a little bit behind Europe. It ravaged Europe right after World War I when they lost all their monarchies. Again, at least for right or for wrong, again, just descriptively, at least the monarchies were preservations of tradition. Well, those were gone. They were replaced with social democracies that went radically socialist. And then you got your big showdown in the 30s and 40s between fascism, communism, and Western liberalism. And then you got your Cold War, and then finally with the fall of the Soviet Union and the increasing fall of liberal globalism around the world, the age of ideology has come to an end. And so now we're entering into an era of identity, and particularly civilizational identity. And so this is why I find things like BLM and so forth just completely lost causes, because it's an identity for identity's sake. LGBTism is a lost cause. It's an identity for an identity's sake, an abstract identity. There's no civilization behind it. There's no culture. There's no tradition. There's no government. There's no politics, nothing. It's just an identity to be able to create another wedge issue to keep us fighting each other so that liberals can stay in power. Good night with that. Those days are gone. So increasingly now, the world is returning to, Russian Orthodoxy, Indian Hinduism, Chinese Confucianism, Turkey Ottoman, Saudi Arabian Sunni, and on and on. The world is going, and then of course the populist revolts that are happening that are just on fire all throughout Europe. France can't even keep a government together anymore, trying to keep the populace out of power. So the world is moving back now in our direction. The world is returning. And for us, I think if we're going to have a sustained return, where again, the notion here, Nick, is everyone recognizes something went wrong. Again, this is what I love, the way you're setting up the questions, because it's just, you're hitting all these frames of reference here. Everyone recognizes something went wrong. So the only way forward is to kind of go back. We got to go back to where we try to find where we deviated from the path. And once we reorient ourselves there, then we can go, we're back on the straight and narrow, as it were. And so that's why everyone's recognizing that the future is kind of literally archaeo-future, or archaeo-modern. It's going back in order to go forward. It's trad tech, and that kind of intersection between the best that the modern world has to offer, combined with the timelessness of the ancient wisdom traditions. So for me, I think I tend to always default back to what Os Guinness called the golden triangle of freedom in the American tradition. And that golden triangle of freedom is where all the founding fathers, and this is Os Guinness's research in this, so I owe a lot to him putting this together. All the founding fathers believed if we're going to be truly free, we must be virtuous, because only as just a thriving civic virtue tradition is going to enable a self-governing people. So if we're going to be truly free, we must be virtuous. But if we're going to embrace a classical civic virtue tradition, then we must embrace faith, because the eternal frames of reference of virtue are found only in the great classical faith traditions. Most particularly, Christianity is the synthesis between the three great classical cities of Jerusalem, Athens, and Rome that gave us our moral, philosophical, and juridical categories. Yeah. But if you're going to have a real faith, a true faith, it can't be coerced. It's got to be freely embraced. So true faith requires freedom, which requires virtue, which requires faith, which requires freedom. You see, this is the golden triangle freedom, and they're all intersected with one another. So how do you maintain that? How do you bring that about? Well, this is where my 20 years in classical education will always come out. In the classical world, particularly of Rome, Jerusalem, Athens, they had a educational project known as paideia. We still use, it's a Greek term. We still use it when we use the term pediatrician, for example. Paideia, it means child, but literally, but it actually meant more the Latin cultura, meaning culture. And the idea was that if you wanted to guarantee the preservation and the flourishing of our civic virtues, you had to inculcate them in our children. And so paideia saw education not as so much information acquisition, as much as cultural formation. Education was that's literally what education means. Educare, it means to lead out. It's to lead the child somewhere. And the question is, where are you leading them to? Again, I think that perfectly closes the loop of how we began this conversation. We're leading them to that golden triangle of freedom. That's where we want them to go. We want them to be free, virtuous, and faithful. Literally a faith, family, and freedom triad there. And so if we can redesign our education system around this classical renaissance that's happening right now, it's primarily in the private school world, but we're seeing it a bit in the charter school movement. If we can
Big in the
get away
homeschool.
from, get away from that globalist, modernist education and you look at any school mission statement or vision statement, it's always, we're here to make global citizens. It's never about we're here to make patriots. We're here to make embodiments of the civic virtue and the
men
American
and women of God, nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, you got it. But that's
let me
what
ask,
classical education's about. It's about recovering the virtues of the great faith traditions that are the foundations of our Western civilization. And by embracing that, we teach our children to be truly free. If we do something like that, I think we're going to see a century that's going to blow us away.
So to that point, and this is something that it was always near and dear to my heart. We homeschooled our 3 kids.
Awesome. Yeah.
And the reason we put them, I remember we got out of the military. We decided to homeschool as kind of like a temporary measure until we figured out where we were going to land. Got here to Virginia, finally got settled, put them in public school for a year and immediately pulled them out.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Like a year later, they're pulled out. All 3 of them have graduated high school now. And it was because of what you said. Like we didn't want to have to compete with a state-run curriculum or a state-run institutions for the ideas and the values that we wanted to impart to our children. And some people look at like, oh, that's indoctrination, to which I usually say, okay, well, somebody's going to indoctrinate your kids. You're just mad that I'm not letting you indoctrinate mine, right?
Exactly.
The difference is am I teaching them? Am I giving them doctrine?
Yes.
That is actually true and noble and virtuous and will encourage them to engage them. So here's my question. As people are looking for answers on how to, okay, great. Maybe they're watching this and like, Dr. Turley, I agree with where we are, how you've described it. I agree with where you want to go. But when it comes to the question of how we get there, that sounds great, but what am I supposed to do? Like, is the government supposed to do that? Is my state government supposed to do that? Is it the next president? Should we not dismantle the Department of Education, but instead use it to our ends? Or is this something where I, as an individual parent, have to once again take responsibility for something that has been, what would you say to that person that is agreeing with your message? Really, Reagan also said, this sounded very Reagan-esque when you were saying this idea that freedom is not just passed along in the bloodstream. It has to be protected and passed on to future generations.
It must be fought for, if I recall.
Yes, for them to do the same. So if the solution that Dr. Turley is giving us is this idea of we need to be able to return to this strong sense of faith and virtue in order to have freedom.
You're right.
And education is the key component of that. What should people be doing in order to foster that?
Yeah, it's a great question. Again, I'm relatively agnostic on how it works itself out ultimately. Do we just have like a Christianized Department of Education or whatever? That we'll see whether it works itself out that way. It's a whole different question. I like the way you framed it. In the end, the question is, what are you going to do? It's a Jordan Peterson sort of thing. You clean up the world first by cleaning up your bedroom. You're right. You got to clean up your own mess, and you got to get involved. And I would argue in classical education in some way, shape, or form. I worked very closely with the Association of Classical Christian Schools. Pete Hegseth wrote a book with the president of ACCS, David Goodwin, on classical education. And they're even bringing in, as I understand, some classical education onto the bases, military bases for the families of our soldiers, so the kids can participate in that. There's also, like you said, a homeschooling curriculum called Classical Conversations, which is brilliant. I mean, they serve hundreds of thousands of families. Again, this isn't peripheral anymore. This is huge. I think there were only 10 classical schools back in 1994. Today, they're well over 1,000. I mean, they're growing. But again, this is what I mean. We're with the grain here. Things are moving in our direction. So I would get involved with the Association of Classical Christian Schools. There's also the Society of Classical Learning. There's a number of classical programs out there, whether you want to go to the school or you want to do homeschooling. You can look to see if there's some charter school movements, classical movements. I know there's Great Hearts. They come out of Arizona, and I think they're in Texas as well. You can take a look at that. But bottom line, absolutely stop it with this, sort of public globalist education. Get out of that, your social justice classes and all these nonsense that the kid, my nephews both had to go to go to those social justice classes at their public school. And they just told me everybody just laughs at the teacher. They just mock it and ridicule it. I love them. God bless these Gen Z kids. So, why bother? You don't have to mock and ridicule. I'm glad they are, but get out of that and get into classical education. You will love it. You will be blown away. I've noticed the key characteristic of a classical student is they tend to love learning. That's one of the things that classical education awakens within the student, a natural love to discover and be awed at the world.
It was one of the, I was speaking at a Young America's Foundation student conference, and somebody asked me about how do we save the schools and whatnot. And I said, one of the things I said, if you fixed everything in the public schools tomorrow, I would have still chosen to homeschool, because it wasn't just that I had a problem with the ideologies that they were pushing. I said it was a mass production approach to education, and you got mass produced results. And when your kids realize that education is not a building you go to,
right?
It is a lifelong process of discovery and gaining knowledge and hopefully wisdom at the same time and capabilities. All of a sudden, it's a very, very different environment. And so my wife Tina and I were speaking at. We're doing the Great Homeschool Convention circuit this year, where we'll be in Texas and Ohio and California.
Awesome. Yes.
Yeah. But Dr. Turley, I want to thank you so much. Every time I sit down and talk with you, it is always such a pleasure. I always feel like I learn a great deal. Where can people find it? You have a book that just came out, America Awakened, which I highly recommend. Where can people find out more about the work that you do and what you're currently working on?
Thanks, Nick, and it's mutual. I love chatting with you. Every time I always walk away going, "Man, that was so cool." I like that. I get so pumped after we chat together. No, they could check me out. They could just punch my name into YouTube. That's my primary area where I am, Dr. Steve Turley. We've got 1.4 million subscribers there, but I'm on Rumble if you prefer. I got a little presence on X, Facebook, and so on. So. I'm pretty much all over social media. There's also a website. You can go to Turley Talks, my last name, and talks.com.
No. And I would highly encourage the audience to go check out, follow, subscribe, Dr. Turley. He is regularly giving content about things that are going on, but his ability to tie it back to concepts of first principles. And just like here today, it's not just this wide sweeping, okay, here's our 5-point plan to do X, Y. It's here's the things you can do to fight for your family, for your faith, for your country, and ultimately your civilization. Amen. Once again, thank you very much for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this. Please leave us some feedback in the comments if you like this series. Maybe some other guests you would like to have us come on to talk about what the right should want and how do we save our country. Once again, thank you. We'll see you next episode.